Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Change on the Run podcast, where we discuss common change challenges and ways you can address them when you're short of time. And I'm your host, Phil Buckley. Today's topic is addressing resistance. It's natural for people to resist change. Their organization is asking them to exchange strongly held beliefs and routines for untested and uncomfortable ones. People resist new ways of working for many reasons, including fear of the unknown, loss of what they know and value, being overloaded, disagreeing with what is new, or the perceived lack of skills required to succeed in their new world. And resistance can lead to anything from indifference to not changing to sabotage. So, how do you address resistance to help people transition from where they are now to where they need to go? And my guest today is Jacqueline Kappers. Jacqueline, welcome to the show.
Hi, Phil. It's great to be here. Thank you.
Thanks for being on. Jacqueline is the principal consultant and founder of Blue Morpho Group, a change enablement firm. She has been a change catalyst for the finance industry and national and international government organizations in the Netherlands, Belgium, the UK, and Canada. Jacqueline holds a graduate degree in organizational development from Utrecht University and certificates of adult education from Western and St. Francis Xavier University. Jacqueline, what is your perspective of resistance to change?
So there are many reasons for resistance in organizational change, but recently I've discovered something that is overlooked and could be a significant cause of resistance, and it's really easy to fix. I do know that we could be doing change differently and perhaps with better outcomes if we were all aware of this one really weird human tendency.
And what's that?
It's the tendency to actually go into fight, flight, or freeze when we're faced with change. Our brains are designed to keep us alive, and our natural tendency when we're faced with a threat is to go into fight, flight, or freeze. Now, that was really helpful for us when we were faced with the possibility of being eaten alive, but that's no longer the case, except our brains don't know that, and they perceive any changes as a glitch in the system or a threat. So what happens is amygdala hijack, and we go into this fight, flight, or freeze mode, which doesn't allow us to think creatively or respond with any kind of emotional intelligence, really. So my take on the thing is, if we understand how our brains work and how to get from amygdala hijack back to thinking creatively and emotionally intelligently, we'll be able to deal with resistance in a far more efficient and effective manner.
But let's say there's 500 people going through the same change. They might be having the same process, but their fears are very different. How do you make sense of that when everyone's going through their own personal change and have potential reasons for resisting? It's a pretty complex matrix of concerns when you're trying to help a group of people from where they are to where they need to go.
Well, that's really interesting that you say that, because 500 people can experience the same change, but each one of them will experience that change differently. And that depends on how attached each person was to the previous state. So one may have absolutely no attachment to the previous state, and the change is introduced and they're like, okay, well, whatever, we'll just keep going. But if you're really attached to the previous state, let's say all of a sudden your company merged with another and your whole product division is being eliminated, the one that you were responsible for, the one that you built, you're really attached to that. So you're going to experience an enormous amount of loss. And that change, combined with the perception of loss or the experience of loss, that's what triggers the behavior that we perceive as resistance.
What is the impact on people when you do get this, presence of, we're moving ahead. I really don't want to hear, any challenges to that direction?
Well, unfortunately, when we perceive loss, we're simply not capable of thinking creatively. We're not capable of problem solving and considering what the future could look like. So essentially, you're asking people who are in survival mode and trying to protect themselves because their brains don't know any better than they're about to be eaten by a tiger, to think about the possibility beyond the tiger. And really, they just want to make sure they don't get eaten. eaten. So what manifests are emotions that we don't really know how to hold in this society. Anger, fear, sadness, apathy. These are socially undesirable emotions. They're judged and shamed. And when people are experiencing organizational change where they experience a loss, people might look at them and say, well, they're just being difficult. So they should just, get on the bus or get off the bus, or just shut up and keep going. So because we live in a culture of toxic positivity, where we're required to always be positive and always move toward the silver lining, there's a discrepancy, or there can be a discrepancy between our internal state, what we're feeling internally, and what we need to project to the outside world. One of the biggest questions that comes up when an organizational change is introduced is, how is this going to impact my job? So if I don't get on board, I could lose my job, or there could be punitive measures introduced if I don't get on board and pretend I'm happy about it, but I'm really not happy about it. So if we do that often enough, if we suppress the emotions that naturally occur with a change that triggers anxiety, then we can get sick, sad, addicted, and isolated. And eventually we see people leaving the company, or increased absenteeism, or lower productivity, increased error rates. Eventually, if it happens often enough, it leads to toxic cultures.
Whenever that happens, and it's not just working longer hours, there's some sort of a turmoil and missing the signs, or not seeing them because they've been hidden. And unfortunately, that person has suffered, which is a tragedy. And I'm fascinated by your thought about the toxic positivity, and often when I'll go into an organization and hearing for the first time what they're trying to accomplish, and where they want to go to, and potential challenges, and some of just the environmental conditions of where they're at now, there'll be a leader typically that will make a point of saying, Phil, I just want you to know, I love change. I eat it for breakfast. I think change is great. I know other people struggle with it, but I just want you to know I love it. And what goes through my mind is, that's interesting that you have this position, but I've never known anyone, including the best leaders, who haven't had some form of fear with a large change that they're leading. How would you respond to that? Have you seen that, or what's your thoughts?
I worked with an organization in New York a few months ago at the beginning of COVID, where the leader had approached me to work with their followers to manage how they were going to work in the COVID environment, because all of a sudden everyone was working from home. So we did the loss work with them, and the leader always appeared calm and collected with their followers, because that's what a secure base leader is, right? Their followers always feel safe because the leaders created a safe, psychologically safe environment. As we did the loss work, the employees were relieved. You could see them come out of their survival mode and be able to think about the possibilities of how they were going to work together in the new normal. That said, and the leader was always calm during that. That said, the leader was having their own reaction, but they were not able to manifest it or show it to their followers. We worked with the leader one-on-one so that they could process the change in an emotionally safe environment that was judgment-free, and they were able to move forward to get to where their followers were as well, so they could all work together. I think as leaders, it's great to say, I love change. And there is some research that says that some people are more change resilient than others. But the fact is that because we don't have a language around loss in this society, and we don't allow for the emotional reactions that accompany loss, we simply don't know how to hold that. And we don't understand the physiological process of adaptation, which is a human process. Essentially, we're asking people to change a lot and fast, but it's sort of like telling people to keep on drinking and never to pee, because we don't allow for the adaptive process that our brains need to go through to get from survival to being able to think creatively. Honestly, if anxiety could be repositioned as something that needs to be suppressed or eliminated, and repositioned to a signal that something has changed and we need to start thinking creatively, then our brains would land on this blank canvas of creativity, and there would be such an enormous potential for innovation and change. But you have to be able to work with the humanity of the individuals that are experiencing this, and honor the fact that their brains and bodies need to go through this process of identifying the loss and having it validated and creating meaning around the loss before they can actually move forward to that bright, shiny future you want to give them.
Certainly. And the point about, I was looking at one of your webinars, and you had a great quote, which is about language. Many of us experience grief, but don't have the language around it, the vocabulary to describe what is going on in our body. And what is that language of grief? And how would you define the language of grief? Do you mean actually the specific words to articulate, for example, what I would be going through during a change?
Yes, exactly. Most of us can identify tangible losses. So those are losses that everybody can see, like a promotion. And you might not think that a promotion would come along with losses, but every change, positive or negative, brings with it losses and gains. They might not be immediately apparent, but they do. So we can name the tangible changes, like a merger or a job loss or a promotion or a move from one part of the country to the other. But we don't have language around intangible losses because we don't even think of them as losses, not in this culture, but our brains register them as losses. So things like loss of the way that we thought our world would be, loss of the way we thought things would go, loss of status, loss of safety, loss of respect, loss of social connections. And there are hundreds of intangible losses. The process for getting through this requires us to name the loss and have that loss validated, preferably in companionship with someone else, because we're social animals. And to process, we really do need to be with another person to talk it through. The other problem is that we have rules around grieving. We have decided who can grieve, what they can grieve, how long they can grieve, how they will grieve, and that creates a whole lot of difficulty for people who aren't on the same schedule as somebody else going through a change. Plus, what change practitioners have done is take the Kubler-Ross model of grieving, which was actually never meant to be used outside of terminal illness, and applied it to human change. Well, I'm sorry, but that is simply not how humans change. They may hit all of those emotions, but it's not linear. And they may not move from shock to anger to denial to whatever. A more accurate model is the dual processing model of grief, which shows that we move between holding on to the past and considering the future, and we oscillate between them. It also talks about numbing out. When our brains are overwhelmed with the change, it's perfectly okay to numb out. So, if you're going to take an extra 5K run or an extra couple of drinks for a while, it's perfectly okay. When our brain gets to a point that it can manage the change, it will start considering what the losses are and then be able to consider what the future brings.
What have you seen with organizations where they, let's say their definition of managing loss is that there's no time to manage loss, like back to the on the bus, and
right.
But from your experience and from your years of helping organizations, people will go through this transition. And as you say, that interim stage where you are going back and forth, that's going to happen regardless of what's on the wall and what the culture says is acceptable. But there's no consideration for it.
No.
What happens then?
Because there's been so little attention given to the role of loss in organizational change, you have hundreds of books dedicated to how to change and how to deal with resistance. And these models all push toward lots of communication and pushing toward the future. There's only one change model, the Bridges model, that begins with loss. But even then, people will take it, or organizations will take that model and say, okay, well, look at the bright, shiny future. We need to get people there. I think if we stood still for a few minutes, if we made space to prepare for the change, prepare the humans in our organizations for change by considering who might experience loss, because not every group or not every person that's going through a change will experience loss, and made space for that, worked with the tools that Blue Morpho has in order to prepare them and transition them through change. Then their change initiatives would cost a lot less. They would have higher adoption rates and likely take a lot less time to implement.
And I had one experience like that. It was a merger. The wisdom of the leadership team at that time is essentially they had a wake. They had a one night wake, and it was pretty quick. So, it's changing in 2 days. So tonight we're having a wake, and being there, it was fascinating because you had all the emotions of the love and the pride of the past, the loss and the tears. You had the extra drinks going on that of just sort of being in a very safe environment where you could say whatever you felt. And people just didn't leave after the appointed time. They stayed at the wake for as long as they could. And my observation was the next day, even though people didn't have a lot of sleep, their perception of the future or even the present was healthier than if you hadn't gone through that process of safe, reflection. Does that make sense from your?
Absolutely. You worked with a very enlightened organization. Ritual is an extremely important human transition tool. And I've heard of funerals for documentation systems. Or even something as simple as gathering everyone together and saying goodbye to the office, right? With drink and food and music and, okay, this is where we were, and next week we're moving into a new office. It's still a ritual that anchors that transition in the brain. And that's one of the tools that can be used. But everyone has their own grief fingerprint. And if we could spend a moment on that, it would be really helpful for leaders and anyone experiencing change to help build their change resilience, to understand this concept. A grief fingerprint or a transition fingerprint speaks to what we as individuals interpret as loss, how we respond to that loss, what we need, what combination of things do we need to implement in order to get through that loss, to manage the loss, how long it will take us to transition through a change, and how we move forward. And there's 7 billion people on this planet, Phil, and each one responds to loss and change differently. So our transition fingerprint is as unique to us as our actual physical fingerprints. And for leaders that understand that, for individuals that understand that in and of itself will greatly increase their change resilience and their ability to deal with future changes.
Have you had the experience where the pausing and taking time and understanding people's fingerprints and sort of addressing the loss where that hasn't happened at all, but then 2 years down the road, and it could be a merger, or it could be even a new documentation system, people didn't move on. They're still using the old one behind underneath their desk, or you had a merger of two organizations, but if you go to certain offices, they still have paraphernalia with the old logo. Have you ever experienced that in your career?
I would be happy to see the old logo on the wall, actually, because part of transitioning properly is honoring the past and taking that with us into the future. I recently spoke with an individual who had an upper management position with an organization that merged with another. And the other organization was the bigger organization. So it was like Big Co was taking over Midco. Midco, we'll just call it that, had a very familial culture. Like you said, that everybody was safe. People didn't move on. They stayed forever, had a very comfortable culture for them. Big Co was far more corporate and just did things differently. And he talked about sort of feeling bulldozed by the new culture and the expectations. And it was like, you get on board or you get out, basically. And there he felt thrown to the wolves, really. He lost his safety. He lost his way of doing things. They lost their language because with the merger, a new language evolved with new acronyms and new ways of saying things. And so it was very disorienting for him. And he lost his feeling of safety and being valued by the organization. And he was a very highly trained senior management professional, and he chose to leave. And there was an exodus, actually, of highly trained professionals that left Midco when Bigco took over. So that's another cost of change, right? What does it cost to rehire and retrain highly trained professionals? If you do it right, if you make space for that loss and transitioning through the change, it'll cost you less.
How do you make space within that, project management environment where, typically, you've got that critical path. You don't have a lot of time to plan, you're late before you start, some of those just dynamics of project management where there's a flurry of activity and things are sort of pushing forward. There's a natural pressure to be green and to have it all done with, which is shortening timeframes, perhaps shorter than what you need. How do you address that when you're trying to give people time to grieve?
I think Stephen Covey put it well with sharpening the saw, the lesson of sharpening the saw. You can try and chop down the tree with a dull axe, but you may as well just take a few minutes to sharpen it, right?
Right.
Be far more efficient. And we need cultural change then. We need organizations to understand that loss is a factor. This is how humans respond. And that as humans, we were given this full spectrum of emotions, each one with an evolutionary purpose to keep us alive. And while we're no longer living in an environment where tigers can eat us, our brains still react that way. So if we were to shift our attitudes around the so-called perceived negative emotions of anger and anxiety and sadness and apathy and frustration, and simply see them as natural responses, brains that are perceiving a glitch in their predictable path forward and are now trying to protect the human so we don't die. If we understood that, then the entire change initiative would flow far more easily. So we need a cultural change. This is simply something that needs to be done at the beginning of every change initiative. It's part of change readiness, right? Mm-hmm. What are people going to perceive as change? Which groups may experience more loss than others? How do we work with those groups in order to go through the loss work and get them on board so that we can move forward to that great shiny future with less resistance?
And have you ever worked with a leadership team, and let's say it's a reorganization and it's tiered and there's different plateaus, so that the senior leadership, they have their new roles and they know what their mandate is and everything is relatively clear for them, but the organization that will report into them still don't know what type of role they have, where it will be, what they'll do. And the leadership team has passed their their curve of working things out from themselves. They're safe, they're feeling good, but their people haven't gone through it yet. Have you ever dealt with that? The dichotomy of the leaders are, hey, we're through it and we're good, and but lacking the realization that everyone else around them has yet to go through that transition.
Well, let me turn that back to you. Have you ever heard of an organization that's done that?
I have. My example would be, again, an organization going through an org model redesign. So what the global teams will do, what the region teams will do, and what the business unit teams will do. And there was a regional team that had defined, sort of how they would be adding value and what their roles would be. And as we were going through a steering committee meeting, I noticed that there was almost a humor around, a casualness of humor, as if there was no stress in the organization, that didn't represent the reality that some people would not have roles in the new organization below their particular level. And there was almost like a silliness, let's say, of casual comfort when the change work was really upon us to manage forward. And when I realized that these people have already changed, they have far more information, they're good, my approach was actually to call it and just to play back what I was seeing. And they were great about the realization that they were inappropriate in the situation of what was going to be happening. And even their laughter that you could hear outside the boardroom, people could hear. And being in the fight, flight, or freeze, laughter can be perceived negatively too.
Mm-hmm. So how did that work for them?
It worked well. It worked well in the sense of awareness was all that was required. And they had the capability, but they didn't have the mirror to suggest what was happening. How do you get people to move from where they are to a position that they can be open to where they need to go?
We have a variety of tools that we use in organizations, a combination of consulting and coaching and teaching. We have some very specific tools that identify the types of losses that people might be experiencing, a loss history checklist and a loss inventory. So once those losses have been identified, then we work with the individuals or the groups to really dig deeper into what they're experiencing and give them the opportunity to process what they're doing. Once we move people from their state of anxiety by addressing their losses, then we can get them to that blank canvas of possibility and creativity. And then they just, take off and think about the future, and which isn't to say that they might not go back to, wanting the previous state every once in a while, because that oscillation between past and future does happen. But the goal is to get them to that blank canvas of creativity where they're thinking about the possibilities of the change. What does it mean for them? What does it mean for the organization? So
great. And how would you know when they're there? Like what do you see and hear and even potentially feel that I think they're in the canvas now. And like what lets you know that, this part of the transition, for the most part, given you could go back, but we're pretty well there.
It's actually magical. I'm going to use that word very intentionally. It's magical because someone who is trying to name their losses and reconciling what it means and why is it a loss and how am I going to use this? There's this heavy energy over them. And when they've moved from that state of holding on to the past and trying to reconcile that loss, when they land on that blank canvas, so to speak, there's this enormous lifting, there's this relief, there's this smile that comes onto their face, or this it can even be as subtle as someone just sitting back. Their body might have been hunched forward and tense, and when they get to that place, they just relax. It's beautiful.
So well said. And I'm wondering, given sort of the spirit of the podcast about change on the run and things going really, really quickly. And then sometimes when there's not enough time to do all the work that we know that needs to be done. And in this case, to support people as they're transitioning and helping them manage sources of resistance. If there was like one thing that you didn't have a lot of time and there was one thing that you would do
Sure.
based on your experience, what would that be that would give you kind of the bulk or the 80% of the results and 20% of the time because it's imperfect? What would that be for you?
I would definitely say be aware that loss is a factor in resistance and learn how to deal with loss. Learn that language around loss and learn how people respond to loss.
Awesome. That's great. And if there is, just as we close off, sort of just a tip or a watch out is there anything that you'd like to share?
Loss doesn't just occur in the workplace. Changes don't just occur in the workplace. Change and death are really the only consistent things in our lives. So look for our losses everywhere and learn how to honor your responses to loss so that you can become more change resilient and practice loss.
Thank you, Jacqueline, for being on the Change on the Run podcast. And thanks for sharing your perspectives. How can people get in touch with you?
Thanks, Phil. They can always email me at Jacqueline, that's JACQUELINE at bluemorphogroup.ca. Or they can reach out to me through LinkedIn, or they can just go to our website at www.bluemorphogroup.ca.
And I'd like to also thank our producer, Charlie Buckley, and thanks to you, the listener. And if you have any questions or comments, please email me at phil@changewithconfidence.com. And for upcoming episodes, please subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform. And if you're someone who'd like to help us out, please make sure you leave a review so that people can listen to the show. And until next time, I wish you all the best as you continue to lead change.